Allometry, the measurements of organisms. Today I want you to define allometry, kind of like I just did. Define surface area and define volume. Seems pretty simple. Relate surface area to volume ratios to temperature and water relations. There we go. List limits on biological organisms based on the principles of allometry. And, just for the fun of things, recognize bad science fiction. I'd actually like you to open up with this YouTube clip from the 1954 thriller, Them. All right. So I want to open up, too, by talking about the idea carrying Biota. So these were early multicellular life forms, and some of these pre-Cambrian species looked very different than what we see, and they're basically a different solution to the problem of multicellularity. When an organism becomes multicellular, there's a problem in terms of the surface area to volume ratios on the whole organism. So imagine, if you will, a single cell. Simple enough to do. Now, if you were to put more cells around it, that cell is now not exposed to the oxygen that is in the ocean water or the oxygen that would be in the air. So that cell now needs to get oxygen through the others, which becomes a problem because diffusion is not fast enough. The idea carrying Biota solved this problem by being, long and thin or tube-like, or one is described as almost quilted. So the different body shapes they tried showed one potential solution to the surface area to volume ratio problem, that diffusion to the center of an organism is simply not a practical solution. Their proposal was simply be flatter organisms or tubular organisms. We'll come back to them. And we'll also come back to Them, the movie, Them. So surface area to volume ratios are really the subject that we're covering today in this lecture. So as an organism increases, the size of the organism's surface increases as a square function. So this would be a moment for you to name some exchanges. What goes across the surface? That's right. Oxygen, food molecules, I guess. Nutrients will go across surfaces. Waste products go across surfaces. CO2 goes across surfaces. And the surface area can be calculated simply as height times width. So as an organism increases, it's a quadratic increase. The size of the surface area is going to increase by a square. But volume matters too. So volume increases as well. All organisms will occupy a three-dimensional space. Any increase in size requires a three-dimensional increase in volume. And volume can be the height times the width times the depth. This is a cubic increase. Now the idea carrying solution is simply to become flatter and longer, thus minimizing the depth. So if the depth is kept at a minimum, then that height times width times depth doesn't really increase the volume that much compared to the surface area. So that can be one way of solving it. However, you look at the movie Them, and the ants, that are they're giant ants, are going to be fighting against humans. And what you've essentially done is you've taken your standard ant size and you've just increased it as a direct proportion. So that means the ant, your normal average ant, has a certain surface area, and if you increase it, say, twice as large, then you're going to have an ant that is going to be, 4 times the surface area. I am assuming kind of a spherical organism here. So it's not exactly that, but it's close to that. And if you really wanted to break down the ant, it's a series of cylinders and oval-like spheres, the legs being the cylinders and the body parts being the oval-like spheres. So this almost works as a spherical ant. You double the size of the ant. Okay, 4 times the surface area, but now 8 times the volume. Okay, those ants were clearly more than double your average ant. So you take whatever size is going to be increasing, and you're going to square it. So if it's an ant that's 200 times bigger, then it's going to be, 200 squared times bigger. And it's going to be 200 cubed, sized, more volume. And what problems occur there is that the exoskeleton is now weighing a lot more compared to the ability of the ant to actually hold itself up. So the exoskeleton would basically be too heavy for the ant to move. Not only that, but ants, on their very small scale, use a diffusion of air in and out of trachea, and to an extent, pumping of air in and out of trachea through their abdomen to breathe. This works on a small scale, but does not work on a larger scale. There is a maximum size for terrestrial invertebrates. There is. Look around and you're going to start seeing the maximum size for terrestrial invertebrates really starts tailing off around handheld size. And I know right now you might be thinking of praying mantises. Well, think about praying mantises and think how their exoskeleton is a little bit softer, and also how you don't get a praying mantis much larger than, well, handheld. Sure, praying mantises can eat lizards, but a praying mantis large enough to eat a cow simply couldn't exist. Spiders, they can get very large. They also have lungs, not trachea. So they have the lungs, they have the limbs are a bit more soft too. So the exoskeleton is a little softer. Just play with a spider, feel it. It's a little softer. It's a little pinch. She'll pinch you back. You think those coconut crabs, they're actually pretty good size, but they're not dealing with trachea, they have gills. So again, this is not so much a terrestrial organism as it is an aquatic organism that has secondarily become terrestrial with the adaptations that it had when it was aquatic. Oh, aren't we all? But this is one of those examples where you have a larger invertebrate, but there is a maximum invertebrate size. And that has to do with this not working well when it comes to the adaptations invertebrates have vis-a-vis exoskeleton and trachea. So if you ever see a gigantic ant like them, you don't have to run away. You don't have to fight against it. It will collapse under its own weight. This is also true for every other organism, of course. The bigger the organism, the more problems it's going to run into. There is a maximum size for every organismal design. And I want us to mainly think terrestrial, because you might be thinking blue whale, and remember that the whole weight problem stops when you're floating. All right, so let's think of some animal examples. I want you to go online. In class, we're going to just go online, look at animals, and just talk and compare them. You can look at this dik-dik. That's what it's called. It's a tiny little antelope-shaped thing. Very small legs and very tiny body. You look at the rhinoceros. Its legs are much more massive. I want you to think about legs as pillars of a building. And then think about how much weight is going to be put on those pillars. And then think about how much surface area the pillar is pressing down on. And then think about how much weight is being put on the surface area of the bottom of the foot. I know you've probably heard the statement that a woman's high heel has more pressure on it than at the bottom than an elephant's foot. I guess it really depends on the woman and the size of the heel. Then that is one of these problems that's going to be occurring on the toes of any organism that you make larger. So think about what limits may exist on organism size. If you want, you can go and look at extinct organisms. I want you to make comparisons within a class of them. So mammal to mammal, dinosaur to dinosaur, bird to bird if you want, but keep them terrestrial. So go and look at some. Post them up in a forum or send them to me by email, and I'll send them to the class. Now go look at plants and leaf width or leaf size. I want you to look at their leaf sizes and compare that to plant height. Remember the cohesion tension theory, that the farther up a plant is pulling that water, the more water has to come out per unit leaf. That means more pull. So if we had a Douglas fir tree with the leaves the size of a big leaf maple, then that's going to be a lot of water that needs to get pulled up. What grows taller, big leaf maple or Douglas fir? Go look it up. Could that be something to do with the leaves? What plants have the largest leaves? Are they that gigantic zucchini I have in my garden, or are they the sequoia? And I want you to compare within an ecosystem where they all have relatively similar temperature and water relations. All right, let's think about how animals can work around this. So the idea of lungs is that the lungs are spheres. No, the lungs are tiny spheres. Yes, the lungs are a series of tiny spheres called the alveoli. Each alveolus has a certain surface area, which is, well, a sphere. So the sphere is the shape with the maximum surface area to volume ratio. So each alveolus is similar to a sphere and has exchange going on across the spherical surface. Having a whole bunch of these in a network allows for an increase in surface area within the lungs. You can also think of the digestive tract, or the intestines specifically. The small intestine has these villi. Has these ridges. The ridges are covered with villi. The villi are covered with microvilli. So these little cells will each have an increase in surface area. The actual surface area of the entire small intestine is much larger than the surface area of your body. Plants have similar adaptations. The mesophyll tissue inside a leaf allows air to actually go into the leaf and exchange with each of these individual cells in the same way as lungs. Roots have individual little hairs that are extending and interacting with the soil in much the same way as the intestine has villi and microvilli. So by changing the body shape overall to have specific areas with increased surface area ratio to volume ratios, the eukaryotic modern animal has new methods of increasing its surface area without necessarily increasing its volume as much. And that's where we can see the idea Karen Biota as kind of a failed experiment. It was an increase in surface area without these little invaginations like the lungs or the mesophyll tissue, and without little microvilli. So the surface area just increased by making the organism bigger and flatter. The limits to an organism's size would be strictly mathematical without any of these adaptations and workarounds that that our current life has. And the idea Karen Biota did not give rise to any modern lineages. Cambrian species gave rise to modern lineages. So there were two separate experiments here in early life for how do we increase surface area without increasing volume in the same amount. And the idea Karen Biota did not work. The Cambrian Biota did. And thankfully, we don't have any giant ants because the limits are physics. The limits are math. So this is some bad sci-fi out there, and I want you to kind of recognize it. When you see giant ants, when you see these titanic monsters like Godzilla, the original Godzilla was horrible. So, allometrically, the movie was great. When you see these, you can recognize the problems and the failures when it comes to allometry. And that's kind of what we're doing today, is getting into that mindset. So what about some real horrific sci-fi? So most organisms, most mammals, came up with a way to decrease their internal heat at the cost of some water. As panting. So panting means that the surface area of the tongue and the lungs becomes the exchange for heat and water. Water is given off and lost, and you lose heat as well. Okay, but one organism came up with a different solution, and that's to allow sweat to go from the entire body through these apocrine sweat glands. So this whole surface area now became a source of water loss. Well, that's expensive, okay? But they also came up with some other solutions. So yes, it's salt loss, yes, it's water loss, but the organism, instead of walking on 4 legs, walks on 2. So now there's less surface area exposed to the sun. So more surface area for exchange of water and exchange of heat, mainly exchange of heat away. Less surface area exposed to the sun means less heat taken up through radiant heat. And now this organism has these forelimbs that are free, perhaps to carry water, perhaps to carry a weapon. So now, oh, and best yet, the organism has hair only on the surface that is exposed to the sun. Well, I guess some of us do. But these organisms could now move on 2 legs with minimum exposure to the sun, carry their own water, and exchange heat better. So on a hot day, if this organism just chased one of those panting organisms, the panting organism loses heat slower than the walking organism, the walking, sweating organism. So that means if the panting organism sprints really fast, its body will heat up metabolically. The walking organism will just kind of jog along, sweating slowly, and losing the heat as it's created. So the human here is just jogging and sweating, whereas the oryx or the antelope, or heaven forbid, the wildebeest, is running and panting, and eventually more heat is produced than can be gotten rid of by panting alone. And that causes the panting, sprinting organism to drop dead of exhaustion. This is horrific sci-fi. That there is an organism out there that just kind of jogs after you. And you can wait, you can slow down, but it'll eventually catch up to you. This is persistence hunting. It's hunting just with the mind and the legs, 2 of our greatest attributes as humans. Now, of course, if you were to do something like throw a rock or a spear or any sharp object at this organism, now you've got a blood trail to follow, and it is slowly losing blood. So the adaptations from there create pretty much the perfect hunter. But the basis of human dominance may very well be our allometry. And when that scientist in them said humans may no longer be the dominant species on the planet, oh no, not unless something has a better allometry, and those ants certainly did not.